Anyway, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has been making his big speech on Brexit this morning, and he was keen to try to set out some clear red water between his position and that of the government. While the Prime Minister has insisted the UK will leave the customs union, allowing it to negotiate its own post-Brexit trade deals, Mr Corbyn has confirmed that Labour will in fact back a customs union with the EU. The Labour leader also said his party would, if it had the opportunity, negotiate a new and strong relationship with the single market. Some Brexit-backing Labour MPs have warned that the party risks betraying those who voted to take back control of immigration and laws, although the speech may have pleased the many more Labour MPs who support a closer relationship with the EU. Let's have a listen to Mr Corbyn speaking earlier.
We've long argued that a customs union is a viable option for the final deal. So Labour would seek to negotiate a new, comprehensive UK-EU customs union to ensure there are no tariffs with Europe and to help avoid any need whatsoever for a hard border in Northern Ireland. Labour would not countenance a deal that left Britain as a passive recipient of rules decided elsewhere by others that would mean ending up as a mere rule taker. The European Union is not the root of all our problems, and leaving it will not solve all our problems. Likewise, the EU is not the source of all enlightenment, and leaving it does not inevitably spell doom. There will be some who will tell you Brexit is a disaster for this country, and some will tell you that Brexit will create a land of milk and honey. The truth is more down to earth, and it's in our hands. Brexit is what we make of it, together. The priorities and choices we make in negotiations.
Jeremy Corbyn speaking a little earlier. And joining us now from Coventry is the Shadow Business Secretary, Rebecca Long-Bailey. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Rebecca, Labour says Britain will need a bespoke relationship of its own, that you'd seek to negotiate protections, clarifications or exemptions where necessary in order to deliver on your ambitious economic programme. So to sum up, you want all the good bits of the single market and none of the allegedly bad bits, which I think the EU calls cherry-picking, and they've rejected.
Well, no, I think there are certain provisions that we know undermine our workers' rights. For example, the Swedish derogation, the posted workers directives, is not in the interest of workers here in Britain, and we would want to seek that exemption. We know that a number of EU countries are currently pressing for it to be removed, and if it isn't removed, we will be pushing ahead with that. But ultimately, the message that Jeremy put forward today was that we have domestic economic problems, deep structural problems within our economy that need to be addressed. We've had significant underinvestment in particular regions over the last 7 years, and people are increasingly making their voice heard that they're not happy with this economic model. Now, we can put in place domestic interventions, and we've said that we'll do that. We're undertaking the most radical and robust industrial programme that's seen a generation in terms of investing in our infrastructure, our skills, our research and development, for example. But that will only work if we have a solid relationship with the EU that supports and complements our industrial strategy on our economic programme going forward.
Right, so what evidence do you have that the EU would agree to all of that? I mean, this really is, as you said once, having your cake and eating it. We want to maintain the benefits that we currently have within the customs union. We want to have our cake and eat it, as do most parties in Westminster. So where's the evidence that the EU would agree to that whole long list of the domestic policies you want to enact while still retaining all the benefits of the customs union and the single market?
Well, look, we've been clear from the start that people didn't vote to leave the European Union in order to have worse terms and conditions, to have lower rates of pay. We're always going to fight for a Brexit that puts our economy, jobs and businesses first, and that's what we set out to do. Now, we know that we're in a strong negotiating position with the EU. We're one of their strongest partners. We're the 6th richest economy in the world. Why would they not want to negotiate a bespoke deal with us in the same way that they've negotiated bespoke deals with other countries around Europe?
So do you think then that the government has an equally strong hand when negotiating its position on the basis that you've just outlined?
Well, the government doesn't have a strong position at all. They can't decide what they're doing from one week to the next. I mean, even in terms of the transition period, for example, they can't agree whether we're going to have existing terms or whether we're going to negotiate a transition period. And we've been quite clear today. So, for example, in relation to the transition period, we'll observe the current terms and conditions of the customs union and the single market so that we're not pushing businesses and workers off a cliff edge, and they're not having to undertake a new set of rules and regulations and then have to do it again once the final deal is reached. We want to provide certainty, and we know that that is not what this government is doing at the moment.
But you still haven't been able to tell us
long-term investment decisions.
Right, you still haven't been able to. You still haven't been able to tell us why your position would be any stronger than the government's. There was a plan that came out of the Chequers meeting with 4 points that then Donald Tusk from the European Union Council rejected as cherry-picking. You're saying that by remaining part of a customs union, that our trade policy will be dictated by the EU 27. Do you accept that?
Sorry, say that again. I didn't hear that.
Do you accept that our trade policy will be dictated by the EU 27 if the UK is part of a customs union with the...
No, and we've been very clear on that today. What we're seeking to achieve is to become part of a customs union with the EU, but that will be dependent on there being a clear forum in which Britain has a very, very strong position in agreeing to or amending any trade deals itself.
But what's your evidence that the EU would sign up? But there's no evidence, Rebecca Long-Bailey, that the EU would sign up to those exemptions, clarifications and protections that you talk about.
Well, we're in a very strong position for the reasons that I set out earlier. We're one of the biggest economies in the world. The EU wants to have a positive relationship with us as we want to have a positive relationship with them. And we know that we are only going to work as an economy and a European economy as a whole if we forge that strong relationship together.
Right, but you've just said that the British government hasn't got a clear direction, although it's stated what it wants to do in terms of leaving the customs union. Well, except they've said they want to leave the customs union and the... Right, but they've said they want to leave the customs union and the single market, which is pretty clear. And even some of the things that they would like to see done in a bespoke deal have been rejected by the EU. So I say to you again, you say you're in a strong position, but there's no evidence for that strong position. Why do you think... But hang on, why do you think you can have the same relationship as Britain currently has now, but somehow give the UK a voice that's more influential than each of the EU 27, that we'd be able to influence EU trade policy more than them?
Well, we're taking a reasonable and pragmatic view of our future relationship with the EU. The government has not been reasonable and pragmatic. They say they want to have frictionless trade. They say they don't want a hard border in Northern Ireland, and yet they refuse to accept that we must have some form of customs union with the European Union. We realise that we can't have that frictionless trade without some form of a customs union, and that's what we're taking to the negotiating table. But we also want to be perfectly clear that we're not going to be a passive recipient in that arrangement. We want there to be a forum, a clear forum where Britain has the opportunity to argue and fight for its future trade deals on appropriate terms that are in the benefit of our own economic interests.
Isn't this just the first step of you ratting, as your colleague Frank Field said, on all those Labour levers? They voted to take back control of the money, of borders and of laws, and you'd sell them down the river to get Jeremy Corbyn into Downing Street.
No. This is about taking back control and ensuring that we have full economic control. But to do that,
well, you can't if you're part of a customs union.
No, we have to make sure that we have a positive relationship with the EU in order to do that. We can't sell out our industrial base. We can't make people worse off than they are now on leaving the European Union. We have to find a relationship that satisfies our desire to leave the European Union, but also make sure that we can maintain those positive trading relationships and other relationships within the European Union. That's what we've set out today.
Will you back Anna Soubry's amendment to enable the UK to stay in a customs union and potentially defeat the government?
Well, we'll take that decision throughout the course of this week based on what the government comes back with. It'll be interesting to see what interventions they make today. As we know, they're at war with each other on the issue of the customs union, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some movement on that very point. Let's hope so anyway.
And on immigration, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn said today that Labour would design immigration policy around need of economy based on fair rules and reasonable management of migration, and make no apologies for putting those aims before bogus immigration targets. Are you committed to ending freedom of movement?
Well, freedom of movement will end, that's a fact, when we leave the European Union. So we have to have a fair and reasonable system in place. Now, that system has to address our economic needs. It has to fill skills gaps and shortages. We have organisations such as the CBI and the British Chamber of Commerce calling for clear guidelines and rules in relation to this to make sure that we can make sure that industry gets the skills that they need. But we've also got to address an underlying issue that we've got within Britain, that we've had chronic underinvestment in our own homegrown skills and talent. 1.15 billion was cut from the adult skills budget, for example, in recent years. So we have to make sure that we're skilling up people who currently live here in Britain, whilst also addressing the overall skills deficit that we might have by making sure that we have a pool of talent ready to take place in our industry.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, thank you. Well, we're joined here in the studio by the UKIP MEP and prominent Brexit campaigner Nigel Farage. Nigel, what did you make of Jeremy Corbyn's speech? Is it a game changer?
It's the first step of a, I think, quite easy to see complete Labour sellout on the SCM. It's perfectly clear. I mean, the nonsense about trade. Governments don't negotiate trade deals. The European Commission negotiate trade deals. If you're part of a customs union, you will not be involved in that. So they've given up on that. And what Barnier will say is, well, thank you very much. That's great. We're very happy with this. But you now need to go further on the single market. So the next big Labour speech on this a few months down the road will be, that we'll be inextricably linked to a single market, but not the single market. I thought the biggest clue of the lot was yesterday on the BBC when Starmer said, we will have to have a new treaty. So we get rid of the current treaty, we have another treaty, and Labour voters are going to start to ask, are we really leaving?
Lisa and Andy, would you like to see Labour commit to remaining members of the single market?
I think, broadly speaking, we're in exactly the right place for the country.
But what about the answer to that question?
Well, that is the answer to that question, is that the position that Jeremy just set out about an hour ago was building on the commitment that Keir made yesterday about a customs union rather than the customs union, access to the single market rather than membership of the single market.
Well, we can all have access to the single market.
Because, as Rebecca outlined, it gives you flexibility to be able to negotiate specific terms, rules and agreements that you want to sign up to and those that you don't. I mean, for me, the importance of all of this that is being lost in all the sort of bluster and hot air is that Labour does now have a very clear position, which is that we see our future as being a high-wage, high-standard, high-quality economy that links us very closely, pegs us very closely to those standards that operate across the European Union.
Right, but but Labour's policy would mean Britain would be a rule taker, and you accept that, and that is where you would be selling levers down the line.
No, that's part of the negotiation. And the difficulty for Britain is that there isn't that agreement within the Tory party, even within the Cabinet. So, the question is, because this is a choice, really, in the end, is do we want to peg ourselves very closely to countries like the US and China and trade on those terms, which will push down wages in constituencies like mine, or do we want to peg ourselves much more closely to the EU? Sorry, Nigel.
With open door immigration,
you've had quite a lot to say.
Hang on. I'm going to come to you on immigration in a moment. Let me come to Chris Gibble. What do you say to that? I mean, are you confident that you will still be able to get Parliament to endorse leaving the single market and the customs union?
Well, I think, first of all, this is about taking back control. People voted in June 2016 to have control over their money, their laws and their borders, and that 2/3 of Labour constituencies voted to leave. They will be outraged if they feel that our future trade policy is going to be set by the EU. The whole point of having a customs union...
No, that's not true.
The whole point of having a customs union means that it will exclude the ability for Britain to be able to sign independently up to the trade terms it wishes to do so. And when people realise that, when people realise that a customs union will lead to this, I think there's going to be serious consequences to the Labour Party of eroding its base.
Right. I mean, Nigel Farage, your party got just under 600,000 votes in the last election. That's against 17.4 million people who voted to leave, as well as all of those, of course, who voted to remain. Why do you still get to define what a proper Brexit looks like?
Nah, look, the party got very few votes because the public believed parties like Labour that actually the Brexit they voted for was going to happen. And now, a few months down the road, we're seeing a very different picture.
There are
4 million. There are 4 million plus Labour voters who voted for Corbyn, who genuinely want immigration reduced significantly and want us to leave the single market, the customs union, and to be an independent country. So this is a sellout by any measure.
But you've always said that Jeremy Corbyn was a Brexiteer. Why wouldn't people trust him to deliver the sort of Brexit that will protect jobs and the economy, as he has stated?
Well, because, as I say, if we continue with free movement, he's made it pretty clear this morning.
They said an end to free movement.
Well, he said he wants to be a citizen of the world. He said we won't scapegoat anybody. I mean, there were so many references there. And he also said Labour's priority will be business commitments, not arbitrary migration numbers. So
jobs.
All this will continue, and
Jobs.
we will, low-paid jobs.
No,
that's right, and that's what Labour have produced for us over the years.
Let Lisa respond.
Well, just, you know, this is absolute nonsense. If it was as true as you say, that you somehow magically know exactly why every single Leave voter in this country voted to leave, and the specific legal mechanisms that they want to see in place afterwards, then why did your vote collapse in constituencies like mine in 2017?
Because we got Brexit.
We stood on a very clear manifesto that
leave
said
the
we
single
wanted
market,
a high wage, high quality economy.
Don't talk over
We
each other.
didn't, though. We didn't. We stood on a very clear commitment that said that we wanted to retain the benefits of the single market. We wanted access to the single market. We wanted to avoid a hard border with Northern Ireland.
All right, we'll come on to that hard border. We will come to the hard border.
As much as it does to people in Northern Ireland.
Let's just talk about
frankly.
immigration. What do you understand by Rebecca Long-Bailey and what was said in the Labour manifesto, that there will be an end to freedom of movement, which is then followed by a new system, a fairer system, says Jeremy Corbyn, of managed migration?
Well, I'm not part of the discussion internally behind the scenes.
But what does it mean to you?
What I imagine that this would mean, and where I imagine this is leading to, whether it's Tories negotiating it or Labour, is probably a system that looks a lot like work permits and visas, looking at the requirements to bring in skilled labour and non-skilled labour.
And with the numbers coming down or not?
Like the agricultural industry. Well, I think that's a bit of a red herring, to be honest, because if you start saying we'll set some kind of arbitrary target for numbers, then you're not looking at the interests of the economy.
Right. I mean, in terms of knowing what people actually wanted about leaving the European Union, are you saying that there are going to be tens of thousands of very disappointed Labour leavers that we're not going to be leaving the customs union if Labour...
No, millions. Millions of Labour voters, very disappointed. I mean, this actually is the Conservative Party's big chance. If the Conservative Party, if Theresa May was able, right now, to grab the immigration agenda, I think she could do massive damage to Labour in the Midlands and the North. I'm not sure whether she'll do it, but everybody was clear. We were voting to leave the institutions of the European Union and run our own lives.
Nobody voted for lower wages.
That is what. Well, they're going to get higher. Well, actually, they're going to get higher wages if we control immigration.
Right.
And if we go global, we could be a richer country. What you've done today, you've stopped us going global by staying part of a customs union.
Right, and that does mean, I mean, you say it would be in a negotiation, but it does mean on paper that Britain would remain a rule taker if we are part of a customs union. There wouldn't be the ability to negotiate free trade agreements in the way that people envisaged, and that is going back on what was promised in the referendum.
No, there would be restrictions on the way in which we could negotiate free trade agreements, but it wouldn't prevent us from negotiating.
Well, except on the basis of being friendlier to the EU and being friendlier in negotiations is not evidence for saying that the EU would give you what you want.
No, but what it would entail, as Keir rightly was honest about yesterday, is that we would have to work very closely with other European countries in order to negotiate free trade agreements. Now, the truth is... Sorry, Nigel, you've had a lot to say about this, most of it nonsense.
Let her finish and I'll come back to you.
And the truth is...
You're not telling the truth.
You're not telling the truth.
The European Commission negotiates the EU's trade deals.
Right, you've said that.
Not one word of it has been true. It's nonsense.
For 40 years that's
and
been the case.
The truth is that this is a choice in the end about what sort of country we want to be. We cannot be simultaneously a high-wage, high-regulation economy and a low-wage, low-regulation economy. We have to choose if we want a close trading relationship with Europe or not, and that's why neither of these political parties is being honest with the British public.
Before I come to you, one of the other issues is about state aid, which is an important cornerstone of what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do if he becomes Prime Minister in terms of economic policy. Labour wants to undermine the principle of no state aid, which is a principle that is crucial to the internal EU market. Why and how?
Well, actually, I disagree with that, and I slightly disagree with Rebecca in the way that it was characterised in that interview, because the truth is that if you look at countries like France, it is just simply not true to say that remaining within the European Union is a barrier to state aid. And in fact,
that's a straw man put up by the Labour Party?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's a genuine fear, but one that is actually, in my view, not fully borne out by the facts. I think it is possible to remain within the European Union. Not that we're leaving, but it is possible to do that and intervene in markets. So I don't think that that is a consideration that should determine any political party's policy.
Nigel Farage, you were stating very clearly earlier that the Commission is the one that is negotiating here. But it's also true to say that other countries have had bespoke deals. I mean, if you look at Turkey with regard to the customs union, or you look at Switzerland with regard to bilaterals.
We were talking in the context there, Joe, of doing trade deals with the rest of the world. And it is the European Commission that does that. Actually, even as members of the European Union governments don't have that much say over it. So you cannot be in a customs union and exert very much influence on outside trade policy. That's a fact. However, I think what is very, very interesting, there's one thing for certain if we stay in a customs union: food will stay expensive, because the other thing that a customs union does, it determines the tariffs that are put on imports from the rest of the world. On items like shoes, food, bras, the things actually that the poorest families spend the biggest part of their incomes on, those things will stay expensive if we stay in a customs union, and that's something that Labour voters need to understand.
What do you say to that? Because it was also a line from Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Tory MP.
But essentially what Nigel's arguing for is a vision of Britain in which wages in constituencies like mine fall, and that means that, relatively speaking, prices are higher anyway. So I think the idea that UKIP are suddenly the champion...
Cheaper food would be
the champion of the poor...
For those on lower incomes...
is not true.
Food reduced by £20 a week for those on lower incomes, for an average family, would be a very good thing.
And Nigel, what I would say to you is that actually that is the difference between the customs union and a customs union, which you just mixed up in that answer. Because a customs union enables you to negotiate.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
You're either part of a legal entity called a customs union, or you're not.
And that is also part of the argument around the single market.
And Lisa, now, would you not accept... I mean, Keir Starmer implied that, in effect, it would be the customs union.
No, a customs union.
Well, in effect, it would be as closer.
I see what you mean. So we're looking to mirror very closely those terms so that we can have frictionless trade and help to move us forward to solving the problem that we've created in Northern Ireland. And that seems to me to be a thoroughly good thing.
Nigel Farage, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jeremy Corbyn's shift in direction on Brexit has stoked speculation that the government could be defeated if Labour MPs and Conservative rebels join forces to inflict a defeat in the Commons over the issue of the customs union. Well, the International Development Secretary Liam Fox yesterday urged potential rebels to keep an open mind.
I would say to my colleagues that Theresa May has kept a broad range of views on the European issue in her cabinet for a reason.
Because she loses power if she doesn't.
We sat down. With those differing views, we looked at the issues, we looked at the options, and we came to an agreement that we are all happy with. And I think that when the rest of the parliamentary party hears on Friday, as the Prime Minister sets it out, what we
She's
have
going to
agreed,
win over Anna Soubry, do you think?
Well, I hope that they will have an open mind and listen to what the Prime Minister says, because I think that what the Prime Minister will set out will deal with a lot of the reservations that they've had.
Liam Fox. Well, one of those potential rebels is the Conservative MP Stephen Hammond. He's put his name to a cross-party amendment calling for the country to remain within a customs union with the EU after Brexit. And he joins us now. Welcome to the Daily Politics. You've just heard Liam Fox saying that your fears will be addressed by the Prime Minister in her speech on Friday. What does she have to say to keep you and other Tory MPs on board?
Well, I think what I hope she's going to say is specify. I mean, we're talking a lot about a or the customs union. A customs union could be a customs partnership or a agreement, which is party policy. I want to hear her talk about how we're going to get over non-tariff barriers, what the arrangement inside a customs union would allow us to do in terms of the deals that Liam wants to achieve. I want to hear her talk about all the sectors of the UK economy. And I want to understand that we will look at the real economics to protect what businesses and jobs in the UK needs.
Will you accept anything less than the UK being part of a or the customs union?
Well, I accept we're not going to be part of the customs union.
All right.
And this is a really important distinction. I mean, I brought with me, because I thought you'd ask me about this, the quote the Prime Minister made in her Lancaster House speech and in our party manifesto. And in our party manifesto, we are committed to a comprehensive free trade and customs agreement. Now, customs agreement could effectively be a customs union. So I am absolutely prepared to be open-minded.
Should the Prime Minister say that on Friday in her speech?
Well, I think, Brexit is a process. It's not just an event. And as part of that process, we've got the negotiations that's going to be taking place later on this month and next month. But as part of the speech, I think, we're talking about semantics when it comes to a versus the customs union. But the key point here is a customs union in itself binds us to a collective decision-making process within Europe when it comes to those free trade deals, which is obviously what we're not going to do.
The key distinction, Chris, between A and the is the does bind us and doesn't allow us to do our own deals. A, if we negotiate, which the Prime Minister has set out she wants to do, and I hope she can achieve, will allow those deals which you and Liam and others and all of the Tory party want us to do alongside ensuring that our relationship...
Although we've just established there isn't evidence that the EU would allow that to happen.
Yeah, there is.
Would you accept a customs union?
No. No, when you look, we're very clear that actually we are looking for a partnership. A partnership is separate from a union. We are not collectively binding ourselves to the EU27 when it comes to setting tariffs that would impose higher prices on those goods coming from outside the EU. And we also want to ensure that we have those deals, you know, with the USA, with China, with, you know, some of the big global nations. We want to be a global Britain.
Right, so it doesn't sound like you're going to get what you want in terms of a customs union or partnership. If you don't, will you press ahead voting with Labour MPs, with Lisa Nandy's colleagues, to force the government to make sure the UK does stay within a customs union?
Well, to be technically correct, of course, they would be voting with us, because...
well, whichever way. But you'll be voting with each other.
But I'd sort of bring Chris back. I think we are very close to an agreement here. I think that with a customs union, it'll be perfectly possible to agree and secure the frictionless trade and the tariff, and I hope, more importantly, the non-tariff barriers. But it will also allow us to do outside deals. And I think that the difference, I'll be looking to see what the difference between a customs union and a customs partnership actually is.
Right, but are you prepared to go through the lobby with Labour colleagues?
Well, I think we're as Chris has said, this is a process. We're a long way from that yet. As Liam has said, rightly, I will listen to what the Prime Minister says on Friday. Until I have that, I'm certainly not going to give a view on something that may or may not happen in May.
Right, what do you make of it being turned into a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister?
I'm sure that won't happen.
Right, but if it were to be discussed, would that put pressure on you to change your mind about voting for an amendment to try and defeat the government on this issue?
Well, I think you've heard Mr Corbyn's speech today, which was vacuous. He had nothing new to say. I think that was clear. He restated the position that he's had all the way along. He had nothing to say about the biggest sector of the economy. He had nothing to say about non-tariff barriers. He talked about the regulatory race to the bottom, which David Davis has already ruled out. So the answer, if Jeremy Corbyn is the answer, the only question is how do you destroy UK jobs, and I won't be doing anything to support that.
Right. What do you say, anyway, to that characterisation of Jeremy Corbyn's speech?
Well, I mean, I think Stephen has to do that to placate his own party when he's considering voting on an issue that potentially puts him at loggerheads with the Prime Minister. But the truth of this, actually, is that there is very strong cross-party agreement that a customs union could potentially solve a lot of the problems that we have. And it seems to me that we ought to be working together in a constructive way to achieve it. I don't think that the electorate would reward any political party that is seeking to make political capital out of this. Our primary concern, all of us, should be how do we advance a situation in which we are leaving the European Union and we do so on the best terms for British jobs and for Britain.
One of the things that Lisa raises in terms of a solution is to the Northern Irish issue, to that border. Being part of a customs union would deal with that in a way that hasn't been, even at the end of that first phase of negotiations.
Well, there's obviously somebody else making a speech today. David Lidington will be making a speech on actually how we want the Brexit process to work for all the areas of the United Kingdom, including sort of Northern Ireland, with Scotland and Wales, and how we create that sort of internal market as well. But the Prime Minister has committed at the end of phase one of the negotiations to dealing with this issue. We recognise that issue.
But there hasn't got a solution.
Well, we've committed to making sure that the Good Friday Agreement remains in place.
Sure, but being committed to it, Chris Skidmore, is not the same as having an answer to how you deal with it. If we're outside a customs union, there would have to be a border somewhere, whether it's down the sea, which would, of course, break up the integrity, as the Democratic Unionists see it, of the UK, or whether there have to be border checks between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which would threaten the Good Friday Agreement.
And this will be brought to a head on Wednesday when the draft legal text is published between the EU and the UK, because there's going to have to be some kind of answer.
And with the draft comes the ability to then further sort of extend negotiating positions, and, it's right that we listen to, Ireland's concerns, Northern Ireland's concerns.
But what's the solution?
Well, the solution, obviously, is to create a border that's as frictionless as possible.
And how do you do that?
Well, I'm not in a position to lead the negotiations. I don't think it's no, because that is then, taking a situation.
The only way you can begin to do that.
When you look at the Northern Ireland situation, with the border there, we have the opportunity to look at how we can preserve the union in the Northern Ireland, but also making sure that sort of goods and services can flow freely across.
No, I understand what the aim is. What I don't understand is the solution if you're outside a customs union.
Well, I believe that we have the opportunity at looking
there
at
isn't one.
Trade opportunities, special passes. We've got the electronic, opportunities to looking at how we can create that border. But it's not a hard border. The Prime Minister has been very clear, and I believe the Prime Minister doesn't want to go back to hard border.
All right.
And we should allow the Prime Minister the negotiating space to breathe here and actually come up with a decent solution.
Right. How concerned are you about your colleagues like Stephen Hammond, who will vote against the government if there isn't some indication of a customs union in the speech?
Well, I was a minister taking through the EU withdrawal bill late last year when I looking at sort of devolution aspects in the Cabinet Office, and we had, I think, 60 amendments, of which there was one defeat. This is a legal process by which we've got to listen, and that's why the government's, delayed the legislation in order to be able to have that opportunity to react with each other.
Come back and tell us what you think of the speech on Friday. Well, if not on Friday, at some stage.
I'll be delighted to do that.
Stephen Hammond, thank you. Any viewers who have a strong allergic reaction to more news about